The Only Good Priest. Tom and Scott Mystery, Book 3. Author Mark Richard Zubro, St. Martin's Press, New York. Narrator Eric Aust. Chapter 8. They searched and we waited. Just past 2, Frank found us poking into obscure corners in a sub-basement. Early in the search, they'd found the lights the construction workers used. These cast feeble glares at random intervals. Frank had Monica Verlaine with him. "This is the owner," he said. We explained that we'd met. Monica wore a fur coat open to reveal a purple evening dress. Monica claimed not to know the woman had been using the place for trysting. Priscilla must have learned about this place and my ownership from records at the newspaper. She'd know work orders and times. She denied all knowledge of their activities. I'd begun to trust her, but now I wasn't so sure. Frank said, "They found traces in the gym. The police believe your story." "They claimed they had Jerry," I said. "I want them caught." Monica said, "Mr. Mason and Mr. Carpenter, I asked you to look into Father Sebastian's death. I'm sorry to have involved your family. Believe me, I had no wish for this to happen." Her sultry voice dropped a level. "I apologize. If I could put an end to all this, I would." Paul Turner, the gay Chicago cop, walked into the room. We'd moved to the entryway of the first-floor apartment. We explained the situation to him, emphasizing Priscilla's admission of the kidnapping. Scott hadn't seen Prentice, so he couldn't swear to his presence. I was sure it was him. Just before 3, we left. On the stoop in the cold wind, as we finished buttoning our coats against the storm, Turner said, "I find your suspicions about the priest's death more credible for the moment. Your problem is why and how." He turned at the bottom of the steps. "You're going to question Prentice? So am I. You'd better come along." We rode in an unmarked police car to Bruce's Halfway. Their bar, I knew it had a late license and would still be open. Prentice saw us walk in and immediately began backing toward the rear exit. I stopped him before he could get to the door beyond the jukebox and back and dragged him to the front of the bar by the belt and shirt collar. The few patrons on this midweek stormy winter night had scattered at the first sign of trouble. Paul Turner had a baritone voice. He spoke slowly and softly in his harsh South Side Chicago accent. "Let him go," he said quietly and forcefully. I took my hands off him. Prentice shook himself, straightened the collar of his shirt, and pulled his sleeves taut. Turner introduced himself and showed his star. "You aren't under arrest, but I'd like to check on your whereabouts tonight." "I want my lawyer," Prentice said. No matter how patiently Turner asked, that's all Prentice said. I grabbed for him when my frustration reached the boiling point. Turner stopped me. We left soon after. On the sidewalk, Turner said, "We don't beat confessions out of people anymore. I know he's a whore. He knows he has to watch his step. He's a pro at being arrested. I can tell when all they do is ask for their lawyer, they've been through it before. If you're thinking of going back after I'm gone, don't. Let the police handle this." He got in his car and drove off. Seconds later, we were back in the bar. Prentice had the phone in one hand. He saw us and quickly hung up. He edged toward the rear. I glided to the back to block any exit. Scott turned the lock on the front door to prevent any interruption. "Get serious, you guys." He stood in front of the cash register halfway down the bar. "You can't do nothing to me." His eyes darted back and forth from one to the other of us. "I wasn't there, honest." Scott lunged for him. Prentice grabbed a bottle from the shelf behind the bar and smashed it on top of the cash register. He held the resulting jagged edge toward us. "I'll use this." He flourished the bottle as he moved closer to me. As he neared, I made my move. Seconds later, the sleeve of my leather winter coat lay and tattered, but I had my hand around his throat and the back of his head up against the wall. "You motherfucker, where's my nephew?" He said something like, "Glack la fluck." I eased the pressure. He tried a few feeble kicks. I reapplied pressure. He stopped struggling and concentrated on breathing. "He can't talk if you kill him," Scott pointed out. Slowly I released him. He slumped to the floor, choking and gasping for breath. Scott got him a glass of ice water and knelt down next to him. Prentice sat on the floor with his back up against the bar and accepted the water gratefully. He slurped for a minute, choked, spluttered, then swallowed. When his color returned to normal, Scott said, "I'm not the nice guy and a good guy, bad cop deal here. I want to hurt you as much as Tom does." Prentice's scared look, which had begun to pass, returned in a rush. "We know you were there," I said. "We only want to know where Jerry is. You gave it away when you tried to take off as soon as you saw us. We'll beat the information out of you, slowly and carefully, if necessary. We won't kill you, but it'll hurt a lot, trust me." Still on the floor, Prentice looked up at me. I'd taken a seat on one side of a booth directly across from him. The aisle was narrow, so our feet were only inches apart. Scott crouched next to him. Prentice let out a disgusted sigh. "Why should I protect those bitches? They're nuts anyway." He crossed his ankles and looked at us in turn. "They think they're part of some vast conspiracy to overthrow the paternalistic underpinnings of Western civilization." He gave a harsh laugh. "If they're lucky, they've got 20 people in their group nationwide, and that's an optimistic count." "Do they really blow up places?" Scott asked. "One, a place in San Francisco, and that almost didn't work. Then their explosives person had a fight with Priscilla over the name of the group. She thought it didn't sound militant enough. This was when Priscilla was out in San Francisco last month." "Who's done the other bombings?" Scott asked. "They don't know. Nutcases. Priscilla thinks other groups saw the sympathy in the donations that poured in after the first bombing, and now they're doing it themselves to get their own publicity. The problem they didn't expect is that all kinds of nut groups began calling the media to take credit. Donations dried up." "Where's Jerry?" I asked. "I don't know. They didn't discuss him while I was there. Even after 17 years of listening to teenage liars, I couldn't tell if this was the truth or not." Turner was right. The guy was a pro. Scott reached out and grabbed the crotch of Prentice's tight jeans and squeezed. The kid screamed in agony. "I'm going to ruin your business forever, motherfucker, if you're lying. You sure you don't know?" He squeezed tighter. Prentice yelped, groaned, swatted, feebly with one hand. Sweat poured freely down his red face. "I don't know," he managed to gasp out. Scott let go. The kid rolled on his side, his hands over his crotch. Scott knelt down to him, turned him on his back, and got his feet flat on the ground with his knees up. Prentice's breathing returned to normal in a few minutes. "Motherfucking bastards," he said. Scott shrugged. Prentice crawled to his feet, using the bar for support. He summoned a few shreds of dignity. "I have to close up," he said. He staggered toward the back of the bar. At the front door, I turned to ask, "Did you know Sebastian was HIV positive?" He looked startled. "No. Guess it's a good thing he refused to have sex with me the times I offered." "What were you doing there tonight?" Scott asked. "Priscilla is my sister." He turned his back on us, binged open the cash register, and began counting the money. Back at Scott's place, as we crawled into his bed, we decided our next step had to be more background on Sebastian. Finding Jerry and the truth about Sebastian's death were inextricably linked in my mind. Turner's questions made sense. Why and how? We'd concentrated on running around and talking to scared or powerful people. Why and how would lead to the who. I wanted to talk to Monica's source more than ever. Just as I was about to fall asleep, I jerked suddenly wide awake. "How do you know I wouldn't get killed when you dropped that thing from so high up?" He mumbled into his pillow. He normally falls asleep on his stomach. I usually nod off, lying on my back. Snuggling after sex can lead to alterations in these habits. "How'd you know?" I said, propping myself up on one elbow and nudging his shoulder. He lifted his head an inch from the pillow and opened one eye. He said, "I aimed." His head resumed its initial position. "You what?" Another nudge. "How do you aim from 4 stories up?" This time he got both eyes open. "Am I the highest paid pitcher in baseball?" He didn't wait for an answer. "Of course I am. That's my job. I throw things at a target. I don't miss." Less than satisfactory as answers go, and hardly reassuring, and not what I wanted to hear, but Before I could think of a question or make a protest, he turned on his side, leaned over, and pulled me close. He nestled my head into his chest. I felt the thick blonde fur there against my cheek. He stroked my back. We talked about love and danger, and then had a bout of passionate sex, and then fell asleep in each other's arms. First thing in the morning, tired from a much too short night's sleep, I called Glenn to fill him in. Then I phoned Kurt to check on strike and negotiation progress. He was at school leading the picketing, so I talked to his wife, Beth. She asked about Jerry. After all these years, she was as good a friend to us as Kurt was. She told me to forget Scott and take care of family business. At 8:30, Monica Verlaine called. Neil gave me your number. I've got my source with me. We could be at your place in 30 minutes. At 9, the doorman called from downstairs to announce them. Monica wore a navy blue suit with matching shoes and a purse, of course. She'd added a gold ring with an enormous black star sapphire set in it. Her source had to be in his 90s. He wore the black pants, shirt, suit coat, and white Roman collar with stiff dignity and pride. He shook our hands firmly. His bald head had a circle of gray fringe. We sat at the butcher block kitchen table. Scott put on the coffee the old gentleman had requested as refreshment. Monica introduced him as Father Gilbert Stewart. He lives in the cathedral rectory. He's agreed to help us. The old man spoke in a soft tenor, a hint of wheeze and crackle well under control. I knew Sebastian in the seminary. The other priest ignored me in my retirement, although a few still remember. Lately, the activities of the priest have bothered me. When Monica told me about your nephew, I knew I had to speak. Something is wrong. I love the church. It's been good to me, but there has to be a limit to what its priests can get away with. Why not go to the police? I asked. Monica convinced me you would be best. Discretion is of the highest importance, and you have it. Scott gave me his coffee. He spent some time adding sugar and cream, testing it several times to make sure it was to his liking. He looked up as he gave the brew a few last stirs. That's one of the advantages of being 92, he said. You can put any damn thing in your coffee you want. You can eat anything you want. And the damn doctors just marvel at you like some icon. He took a sip of coffee and smiled appreciatively. You can also be as honest as you want. You need help in solving this murder? Let me tell you about myself first. You need to be able to trust me, first of all. I'm gay. Scott and I stirred in our chairs and looked at each other. Monica took this news impassively. He told his story between sips of coffee. He discovered his sexuality when he was in his 20s, long before anyone even dreamed of a gay rights movement. He knew Henry Gerber back in the 20s in Chicago when Gerber and a group of other men formed one of the first gay rights groups in the country. We were all extremely closeted. No one used last names. Being part of it was horribly daring for a priest at the time. Henry Gerber founded the Society for Human Rights, a group chartered by the state of Illinois on December 24th, 1924. They published a paper called Friendship and Freedom. Their activities quickly led to trouble with the police. A number of people in the group, including Gerber, were arrested without a warrant. Eventually, the charges were dismissed, but Gerber wound up losing his job. Of course, no one knew I was a priest. I wasn't arrested when I found out about the trouble. I never went near any of them again. That was so sad and so cowardly. Then in his first parish assignment in Chicago's West Side, he'd fallen in love with an assistant pastor a few years older than himself. Amazingly, their relationship blossomed into a lifelong attachment. We loved each other, very deeply of course. We had to be exceptionally careful. It's bad for gay priests now, but then it would have been ghastly. We'd meet in secret. We had sex only rarely, but it was all the more passionate for that. We got transferred to different parishes, but we managed to keep our relationship quiet and exclusive all those years. We were faithful, more from circumstance than from chance. He died 3 years ago. After working in parishes for 15 years, Father Stewart had been assigned to various positions in the seminary program, finally being put in charge. He'd known Sebastian well. He and John Smith, whom you've already met, were incredibly close. They did everything together. I had to warn them several times to be more discreet. It was dangerous to form particular friendships in those days. It still is. Sebastian and Smith took part in much of the civil rights activities in the early 60s as newly ordained priests. They'd both gone to Selma, Alabama to take part in the marches. He looked at his empty coffee cup. Scott refilled it as Stewart performed his rituals with the liquid. He continued. Monica, of course, has told me everything. He sipped coffee and coughed. You should have seen the cathedral rectory these past weeks. I've seen the same kind of activity when a priest molests a child. Secret meetings, everybody knowing a little piece of distorted fact, and nobody really knowing anything. It's like a hive of old queens trying to know all and be discreet at the same time. It turned out that the new cardinal hated gay people. Even more, he wanted absolutely no publicity about priests testing positive for having or dying of AIDS. The hierarchy was always hideously worried about scandalizing the faithful. Buzzwords like national security for covering up when priests or politicians broke the law or, in general, screwed up. Smith is in charge of the cover-up. You wouldn't believe the clout the church still has in this town. If it was AIDS or murder, Father Stewart went on to explain, he wanted the truth to come out. Were Sebastian and Smith actually lovers back then, I asked. You ask a question I thought about a great deal. They were both attractive boys and very popular. Everybody liked them. They'd both have gone far. Smith dropped the relationship a year or so after they were ordained. I never knew why. He advanced far, as many of us thought he would. He could have his own diocese someday as bishop. Sebastian never compromised his principles. He kept marching for every cause. He upset parishioners and priests. I wish I'd been as brave as he was. They couldn't keep him from being a pastor, but he knew he'd never advance much further in the system, and it didn't seem to bother him. He took a long sip of his coffee and stared out the window over the lake. Were they lovers? No, I don't think so. If I had to make a guess, I'd say it was because Sebastian demanded more than Smith could give. John Smith is a good man, a fine priest, but he has his limitations. Sebastian has his faults, too. As a seminarian, he could drive you nuts with his intensity and commitment. This is all hypocritical bullshit, I said. Father Stewart smiled softly. He was the first priest we'd met who didn't indulge in condescension and put-down games. Two skills they must have classes in for the modern Catholic seminary. Monica blew out a long stream of smoke and eyed us all carefully. You think being a priest and gay is hypocritical? The priest question came out softly and reasonably. Scott nodded. Do you have any idea of how many priests are gay? We all shook our heads. Some estimates go as high as 50%. I can tell you from my own observations of 3 decades in formation work that it is probably higher than that. He told us that most gay priests hide the fact from others and from themselves. That lots of Catholic boys discovering they didn't like girls translated that into believing they'd be able to cope with celibacy with no problem, and thought they had a calling. They do decent work for a number of years, but eventually most of them begin to figure it out. Even it's too late to leave, running a parish leaves you woefully unqualified for any jobs in the real world. Father Stewart told us that when you listen to priests talk about life in the real world, it was often quite sad. They would sneer at the strivings of their parishioners and yet be fearful of ever leaving the protection of Holy Mother Church. For the older ones, it was worse, to leave in your 50s or 60s, with no pension behind you left, a man to face years of poverty-stricken retirement. So they stay, and they're miserable. The alcoholism rate among priests is appalling. Why not just come out? Scott asked. What could the church do to them? From what I heard, it's impossible to defrock somebody once he's in. They're afraid of the same thing many of us are afraid of. Rejection, loss of status, fear of reprisal, lots of current assignment and future promotions, lots of respect, scandal, and then there's all that child molestation myth shit. The profanity from the old priest surprised me. He took another sip of coffee and said, "What I'm telling you isn't a big secret. Most of it's in James G. Wolfe's book, Gay Priest. You should read it." "I guess," Scott said. Stewart pointed at Scott. "It's very much like what would happen if word got into the press that you were gay. You'd still be a superb baseball player, but the hassles would be enormous." "The anticipation of discrimination can often cause more problems than the discrimination itself," Monica said. "A guy named Ross wrote an article about it. You should read." Stewart said, "I'm afraid our new bishop is only going to make things worse, of course. He fits the classic mold of the self-denying homosexual who is the worst enemy of gay people. He's the type who would prosecute them the most eagerly." Monica said, "Sebastian was the only priest I've ever met who could balance his celibacy and yet be sensitive, emotionally responsive, and happily at the same time. That kind of balance is rare in a gay priest. Most are so unhappy." "Do you know anything about Sebastian's family?" I asked. "I believe they're all dead," Stewart said. Monica said, "He rarely mentioned them. He did say once that he came from a family of Episcopalians. He converted while in high school. He said his family had a major problem with his being a priest." "My suggestion as a place for you to start is another interview with Bishop Smith," Stewart said. "You've gotten in once before. He can be very difficult. I'd like to help, but I'm just an old fart he'd ignore, and I don't want to be revealed as your source of information. I may be old and safe, but I'd like to continue to be of use. Revealed, I can do you very little good." They left, and we called the cathedral rectory. Smith wasn't home. We could try the chancery office. We called, but Father Smith was unavailable. We decided to try barging into the diocesan offices and demanding an audience. I wasn't about to put up with some ecclesiastical bullshit. The diocesan offices took up the bottom floors of a high-rise on the corner of Michigan Avenue and Ontario. We parked at Scott's building and walked over. The wind and rain of the night before had given way to a cool, crisp morning. Without a covering of snow for reinforcement, the Arctic blast had a harder time getting a solid grip on the city. We arrived at the chancery shortly after 1. We used Scott's name to move secretaries in the mountain of bureaucracy to action. Even the Catholic Church was susceptible to the power of fame and name-dropping. All business came to a halt as friend called to friend. Father Smith discovered us amid a horde of adoring fans, both male and female. When Smith arrived, priests and civilians gave him weary looks and moved quickly back to their assigned tasks. Moments later, he guided us through empty halls to a third-floor office. The room contained a massive desk flanked by the American flag on the left and the papal gold and white on the right. The wall on the left had 3 enlarged frame photographs, and each we saw Smith with, starting from the door, the Pope, the priest, and the mayor of Chicago. The other walls were barren beige. The carpeting was light brown. In front of the massive oak desk sat 2 deep maroon leather chairs. We each sank into one. He took his seat in the massive swivel chair behind the desk. He smiled benignly, steepled his fingers, and placed them under his chin. The light from the windows behind him created the godlike effect he wanted. Smith began some pleasant, innocuous comment. I cut in quietly. "You and Sebastian were lovers 30 years ago." The maddening smile went on. "And if we were, so what?" he murmured. "Are you going to send out a press release?" "No one would print it." "No one cares. His soon-to-be Cardinal Eminence doesn't care. Believe me, he sympathizes completely." "How can he be sympathetic and justify closing down faith?" I asked. Smith spread his hands palm up. "He can be gay and still close it down. Rules are rules. Rome has spoken. If you can't buy the program, get out." "You've had it both ways," I said. "I've done a great deal in my small way for gay Catholics. When faith got thrown out of their church, I got them all their supplies, vestments, chalices, wine, hosts. My conscience is clear." The hands returned to their accustomed place under his chin. "Sebastian was HIV positive," I said. "Yes, I know." For the first time, a slight crack appeared in his smug exterior. Did that bother you? I asked. Supposedly you were still close friends. We were, he said. His eyes got misty. But it was too late for me to do anything about it. I let his wistful words fade to silence. Finally, he shook himself and turned cold eyes to us. What else do you dare to ask? Why did you involve Father Clarence in all this? As head troubleshooter for the diocese, I take an interest in every priest who might cause scandal for the faithful. In an excess of guilt, he might confess all. I had to prevent that. Perhaps I was excessively harsh with the young man. Is this the way you handle all the young priests under your care? Scott said. You become their special friend. Although Clarence strikes me as relentlessly heterosexual. I'm afraid he is. Attractive he might be, but I've never touched him, as I never touched any other young priest. If you were so close to Sebastian, why aren't you concerned about finding the cause of his death? I asked. He smiled wanly. He was already dying. We sat in silence for a moment. Suddenly Smith sat up straighter in his chair. Because I knew of his antibody status, I presumed his death was connected to some aspect of the syndrome. He cleared his throat. Besides, which one of the major roles here is to prevent what we call scandal to the faithful? He explained that to all but the incredibly stupid, this catchphrase meant the church was covering up another fuck-up. I didn't tell him. We already knew this. He went on to say that as the AIDS epidemic spread, more and more priests had been dying of the disease. Various dioceses managed to conceal the true cause of the deaths. However, word had leaked out, and some cases and reports had gotten into the press. We can't have that kind of publicity. Gay priests and AIDS, supposedly the Pope is furious about the whole issue. We've got strict orders, no publicity about gay priests, with or without AIDS. I can tell you that cover-ups in this city are quite possible. We need the autopsy report, I said. Actually, you don't, the benign smile returned. The report states he died of natural causes. No examination of any kind occurred. You'll get no help there. People value their jobs too much to blab to you gentlemen. But in this case, there is nothing to blab. Nobody found anything because nobody looked. I wanted to grab the thick gold chain that held his heavy gold cross and wrap it tightly around the stupid smug throat. You don't care that somebody may have killed him? Scott asked. He had the decency to look thoughtful before he gave a cold no. We asked if he knew of any current problems, boyfriends or priest. Sebastian was close to. We got simple no's. Minutes later, we left. Before working out at Scott's, I called Glenn and Jeanette. Glenn's voice had lost all the bounce and verve it normally had. I spoke what words of encouragement I could. We'd been exercising for an hour, and I'd just finished my third set of 8 chin-ups. When the phone rang, I grabbed a towel from the pile by the universal weight machine, then hurried to the phone on the wall. I wiped off sweat as I picked up the receiver. It was Mildred Weber from St. Joseph's Rectory. We have to see you boys. She wouldn't tell me what for on the phone, but we could come to their home right after dark. Feeling only slightly ridiculous, but on the off chance they really knew something, we drove to the suburbs across the street from the Webers. The rectory blazed with light. We found their house completely dark. Climbing the stairs, I felt uneasy. I had my hand raised to knock when the door jerked open. A hand reached out and yanked me in. Hurry! An elderly voice whispered. Scott jumped in behind me. Mildred put her fingers to her lips. The dimness made close observation difficult, but I could see overstuffed furniture covered with lace doilies cluttering the room. She dragged us to the front picture window and knelt on the floor next to Harriet. Mildred motioned for us to join them. Down we crouched. Between the closed drapes and the window pane was a 2-inch gap. We always watch from here, Mildred whispered. I looked and saw in the lit rectory. I detected no human movement. What's going on? Scott asked. Mildred explained without taking her eyes off the rectory. She said, It's been going on all afternoon. First that awful Bishop Smith showed up. Father Sebastian introduced us once, Harriet said. I didn't trust him from the first minute, did I? They did their night routine. Smith had stayed an hour. Constance quit in a screaming fit around 4th. Smith left soon after. Clarence snarled at Mildred and Harriet. They left. directionless and at a loss without even preparing supper, something they'd always done. Since then, a woman had driven up. From the description, I guessed her to be Clarence's wife. In the middle of her visit, a small moving truck had driven up. They spent a half hour moving Father Clarence's things out of the house. They'd driven off 20 minutes before we drove up. Fascinating as all this might have been, I didn't care about Father Clarence unless he was part of the kidnapping solution. He'd lied to us, but even if Smith told us lies too, I'd begun to suspect Clarence was an innocent man, caught in a web far beyond his own comprehension. He had enough problems of his own. After watching 5 more minutes of no movement, I said, "Why did you call us?" They eased their creaking bones off the floor and drew us deeper into the house. A swinging door led from a dining room into the kitchen. Before turning on the lights, they pulled all the shades and shut the drapes. Once my eyes adjusted to the light, I gazed on a room that looked exactly like a maiden aunt's kitchen should, from the metal canisters with ingredient labels on the outside to the embroidered "God Bless Our Home" framed plaque. A filled glass cookie jar sat on a corner of the counter next to the refrigerator. The room smelled of fresh bread and musty old wood, mixed with spices on the tip of recognition. They seated us. A plate of cookies, fresh bread, and corn muffins appeared along with tall glasses of milk. At first, we tried saying no thanks. It was like trying to refuse your grandmother. We ate and sipped and waited. When we were sufficiently fed, they brought out their revelation. Harriet got out a step stool from the pantry, climbed it, and pulled a stack of mail from the top shelf of the cupboard over the sink. "This is Father Sebastian's mail," she said. I raised an eyebrow. "We didn't steal it," Harriet said. "We've been in charge of sorting mail at the rectory for 20 years. Mildred added. Constance and Father Clarence tried to take the job away from us, but Father Sebastian came to our rescue. They hadn't known what to do with the dead priest's mail. No one seemed to care when they asked, so they kept it and brought it home every night." "It was my idea to show it to you," Harriet said. "Like those detectives on TV. You're so young and handsome, and you were so polite last time. We wanted to help you. We thought this might be a clue. There must have been 30 envelopes all open. I asked about this. Father Sebastian trusted us. We'd open each piece of mail, examine it, and decide on its importance. We placed it in separate piles on his desk every afternoon. We'd been doing it for 10 years. It saved him time. Plus, you thought you might try a little detective work yourselves," Scott suggested. They nodded. "But it didn't do us any good. We couldn't find anything important," Harriet said. "Then we thought of you, and you were such nice boys. We wanted to see you again." She smiled shyly. "We forgot to get Mr. Carpenter's autograph. I felt odd looking through a dead man's mail. It seemed illegal, or at least indecent. This gave me pause for a second. If anything here gave us a clue to finding Jerry, I wasn't concerned about esoteric legal points. The 4 of us sat around the Formica tabletop on plastic-covered chairs. The woman watched as Scott and I divided the stacks. I started with very little hope. They'd seen too many TV shows. My stack had a few bills, a lot of junk mail, and a personal letter from a former parishioner, now living in California. I examined everything carefully. The letter was innocuous and pleasant enough from someone unaware of tragedy. The bill showed no pattern. A few meals on his Visa charge at suburban restaurants didn't reveal anything. The MasterCard bill showed some purchases at a men's clothing store in the past month. It could have been socks and underwear. No singular fact leaped out to reveal a hidden life. Scott sat leafing through a small stack of canceled checks. He had the other mail sitting to his left. He slowly began separating the checks into 2 stacks. "Find something?" I asked. "Maybe." The 2 women and I leaned closer. Scott pushed one stack to his left. "Those are ordinary checks." Then he held out 4 checks in a fan. "These are all made out to Dr. Hiram Kramer. All for $75. Each a week apart." Harriet and Mildred didn't have a clue as to who Hiram was. I had a guess, maybe a medical doctor, but probably some kind of therapist. We checked the local phone booth, but found no listing. We tied directory assistants. Hiram had an office in the Loop and lived in Rogers Park on Sheridan Road. We decided against a call and voted for a visit. We thanked Harriet and Mildred. It was a slender thread, but better than anything else we had to go on. Scott hurried out to his portion, came back with enough baseballs for all their nephews and nieces. He gets so many requests for signed baseballs. He started carrying a supply in the car. They beamed at us. They wanted to give us supper, but we managed to beg off. We drove to the city up I-57 to the Dan Ryan Expressway, took the Stevenson to Lakeshore Drive and up to where it ends at Hollywood and turned right onto Sheridan. I hit a huge pothole at full speed. "Easy," Scott said. "We're not even sure he'll be there or if he'll tell us anything. We probably should have called ahead." I slowed down, but not much. Hiram Kramer lived in the last high-rise before Sheridan Road turns to go around Mundelein College and Loyola University. He was home. When the security guard mentioned Father Sebastian's name into the phone, the person on the other end gave him permission to let us in. I knew immediately as soon as he opened the door that this was the mysterious stranger who met Sebastian on Sunday night at Roscoe's. Short, slight, with dark hair and a pipe. He showed us into a living room, furnished in books. 8-foot-high bookcases filled every available wall. A roll-top desk placed in front of one of the floor-to-ceiling windows gaped open. Kramer sat on a swivel chair in front of the desk. He seated us in 2 canvas-backed captain's chairs, the only other seats in the room except for a long black leather couch. After our introduction, he acknowledged Scott with congratulations on his 9th 20-game season last year. When Kramer settled himself into his chair, leaned back, and placed his stocking-clad feet on an open desk drawer, I explained why we'd come, where we found out about him, and how we needed his help. He fiddled with his pipe, tamped down the tobacco, then used a lighter. The resulting flame reached at least 9 inches on each puff. He grinned in satisfaction and faced us. He needed a beard on his face for the right cliché effect. Instead, he showed us yellow teeth and said, "Even though he's dead, I'm not at liberty to talk about him." "Someone killed him," I said. He took the pipe by the bowl and stared at us. "There's been no mention of that in the papers. Why hasn't anyone heard?" "I can't believe it. His death was shock enough. He was the only good priest I ever knew." I spoke as persuasively as I knew how, trying to get him to open up. He wouldn't budge. He talked about professional ethics. "At least tell us about your relationship with Father Sebastian." "It had to be more than professional," I said. He puffed on his pipe dutifully for a minute, then said, "I can go into that a little bit. We met in seminary, both just out of high school. The two of them had discovered a shared interest in medieval chant. Their mutual sexual orientation had led to little more than a bout or two of mechanical fumbling. We never even got all our clothes off. We decided our friendship was more important than sex. Besides, in those days it was necessary to be exceptionally discreet. I asked about a liaison with John Smith. I got a surprised look. "How'd you find out about that?" I told him we'd had talk with Smith. He fumbled with his pipe, knocked out the ashes, rearranged some papers on his desk, and finally picked up a pen and tapped one end against the desk. With a conscious effort, he stopped fidgeting and gave me a direct look. "Even if it was murder, what would a 30-year-old relationship have to do with it?" "We were hoping you could tell us," he frowned. "I guess I can tell the story, but it reflects more on me than on Sebastian or Smith." He took a deep breath and began to talk. 30 years ago, he and Sebastian had been as inseparable as the restrictive rules at the time permitted. Vince Smith had entered the picture. For a while, the three palled around together. After a while, he realized the other two had begun to leave him out of their activities. He'd confronted Sebastian. They'd argued. He got a soft look in his eyes. They glistened with moisture. My jealousy consumed me. He offered friendship. I wanted him exclusively. He was so damn kind and understanding. I left the seminary rather than see the two of them together. Hiram told us he'd done a lot of growing up, got some therapy, and joined a program to become a psychotherapist. During that time, Sebastian looked him up. They'd kept in contact. Then 2 years ago, Sebastian had come to him to ask formally to be in therapy. He'd insisted on paying like any other client. Were Smith and Sebastian lovers? You mean, did they have genital contact? His eyes flashed angrily. I have no idea. I didn't want to know then or now. If you mean, were they in love? In a schoolboy crush way, I suppose you could say yes. His tone and manner, though, said yes, he did care. I thought to myself, some hurts never go away. Kramer insisted that while they were still friends, their relationship for the past 2 years was definitely client and therapist. Did he tell you he tested positive for the AIDS antibodies? I asked. That's something I'm not at liberty to discuss, I sighed. It was impossible to find out anything they discussed in therapy. I asked, why meet at Roscoe's? Why not? It was convenient. I drove down. It made less of a trek home for me. You won't tell us anything? I asked. He relit his pipe and gazed at us over the smoking bowl. You gentlemen asked for a great deal. I understand your emotional involvement because of your nephew. You aren't the police. I told you all there is about Sebastian and me, but you're a couple of amateurs who can be of little benefit to my former client. It is his interest I need to protect, even though he's dead. Puffs of smoke escaped languidly from behind the hand that engulfed the bowl of the pipe. A minute later, he put the pipe down and said, You're obviously used to people being charmed by Mr. Carpenter's fame, or perhaps the people you request information from are swept away by the force of your obvious emotion. I'm not. Come back with a court order to put me on the stand. Then I might talk. Minutes later, we gave it up as futile. At Scott's place, I called Neil. I told him I wanted the remaining members of the Faith Board of Directors in the penthouse within the hour. He began a few protests, but I issued orders, and for once, the old queen shut up and did as he was told. 5 minutes later, the intercom phone rang. That was quick, I thought, but it wasn't Faith. The doorman asked us if we'd see Detective Turner. A Gay Mysteries audiobooks. I think it is easy to hate a label, but a face humanizes the word. So this effort is twofold. To offer comfort to those like myself that your world didn't end because you don't fit into the view of acceptable society on both sides. And in hopes of helping those with family that are LGBTQ, that it doesn't mean we are aliens from the child they once knew. Reassure them so they can maybe be supportive at the same time, being true to their values.